Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be here, and I have to say, the material we are covering today is, well, it's intense.
Oh, absolutely. Today we are taking a deep dive into a very messy, very murky landscape of human history, human psychology, and spirituality. Our mission today is to plunge into the first 7 chapters of the ancient text of 1 Samuel.
Right.
And I want to be super clear right up front. We aren't here for some dry history lesson. We are acting as your guides to help you extract practical wisdom, the moral insight, and real-world life application from these ancient events.
Yeah, because there is so much to apply here.
Exactly. So to do this, we're looking at the primary text of 1 Samuel, chapters 1 through 7, and we are pairing that with profound historical and theological analysis from 2 classic commentators. We've got Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry, and their insights into this text are just, they're incredible.
They really are. And what is so fascinating here is just the sheer scope of the journey we're about to take you on. We are going to move from a weeping, deeply misunderstood woman who is basically trapped in a toxic household, right to the dramatic, catastrophic collapse of a corrupt institutional dynasty.
That's a massive shift.
It is. And then we're going to look at the terrifying reality of what happens when a nation tries to treat the divine like a lucky charm. Ending, finally, with that same nation finding its footing again through this really profound structural repentance. It is just a massive narrative arc.
It really is a massive arc. You know, usually when we talk about diagnosing a problem in our lives, there's this expectation of precision. It's like engineering or medicine. You know, if you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line. The doctor points to it and says, there it is, broken.
Right. It's totally binary.
Exactly. It's binary. It's clean. But when you step into the world of human neurodevelopment, trauma, complex spiritual states, which is exactly what 1 Samuel opens with, that x-ray machine is utterly broken.
Yeah, you're in muddy waters.
Completely muddy waters. And we see this immediately in the hill country of Ephraim at a place called Ramathaim Zophim. We meet a man, a Levite named Elkanah. He has 2 wives, Peninnah, who has children, and Hannah, who does not. So set the scene for us. What is the cultural and psychological reality of this specific household?
Well, to understand the sheer tension in that house, we really have to look at the historical context the commentators provide. We are in the era of the Judges.
Which is just chaotic.
Oh, incredibly chaotic. It is a time in Israel's history, a time when, as the text often repeats, every man did what was right in his own eyes. There is no centralized king. There's no firm moral compass at the national level at all.
Right.
And Albert Barnes notes that Elkanah represents the 5th generation of settlers in Canaan, so they're living about 130 years after they first entered the land. Now, regarding his 2 wives, polygamy was permitted, or at least tolerated, by the civil law of the time, and it was certainly sanctioned by the historical practice of patriarchs like Jacob.
Sure, it was the cultural norm for some.
Exactly. But as Matthew Henry astutely points out, just because something is culturally tolerated does not mean it is psychologically healthy.
Oh, man. That is such a good point.
Right. It almost always created deeply divided, factional, and just intensely miserable households. You are essentially hardwiring a zero-sum competition right into the foundation of a family.
That is a recipe for absolute disaster. And the text shows us exactly how that disaster plays out in real time. Every single year, this family makes a pilgrimage. They go up to the tabernacle at Shiloh to worship and sacrifice. And the text describes Peninnah not just as a co-wife, but as Hannah's adversary.
Yeah, that word choice is heavy.
It is. It says she provoked her severely to irritate her year after year.
And Matthew Henry offers a really brilliant psychological insight into Peninnah's behavior here.
Yeah.
He points out that Peninnah couldn't bear the blessing of her own fruitfulness without growing haughty and insolent. Yeah, she had the children, which, was the ultimate status symbol in the ancient Near East, but she still felt deeply insecure. Why? Because she envied the fact that Elkanah clearly loved Hannah more.
Which is such a complicated dynamic.
It is. The text tells us that whenever they went to Shiloh to sacrifice, Elkanah would distribute portions of the sacrificial meat. He would give Peninnah and all her sons and daughters their portions. But to Hannah, he would give a worthy portion, sometimes translated as a double portion, explicitly because he loved her, even though she was barren.
Which ironically makes the target on Hannah's back even bigger.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, Elkanah is trying to show love, but he's actually fueling Peninnah's resentment. It makes me think of like a real-life internet troll, or maybe that one highly toxic coworker who subtly undermines you in the group chat.
Yeah, the one who knows exactly where to hit.
Right. They know exactly which emotional buttons to push. But what's so insidious about Peninnah is her timing. She doesn't just do this on a random Tuesday. She does this at the religious festivals.
Right at the worst possible moment.
Exactly. Right when Hannah is supposed to be focused on worship, on gratitude, on spiritual connection, Peninnah weaponizes Hannah's deepest vulnerability. In an honor-shame culture where a woman's entire societal worth was tied to her ability to produce an heir, Peninnah uses that to make her fret.
Exactly. And look at the physiological toll of that chronic grief. You have to ask, how do human beings handle chronic, unfulfilled desires when they are inextricably linked with relational toxicity?
It tears you apart.
It really does. For Hannah, the emotional trauma manifests physically. She loses her appetite entirely. She weeps bitterly. The text states bluntly that she did not eat. Matthew Henry observes that her trouble took away her appetite and made her wholly unfit for any company. She was in what the text calls bitterness of soul.
It's an early depiction of deep clinical level depression, and Elkanah's response is, well, it's classic clumsy fix-it mode.
Oh, it's so bad.
It is. He sees her crying, he sees her not eating, and he says, Hannah, why weepest thou? And why eatest thou not? And why is thy heart grieved? Am not I better to thee than 10 sons?
He just totally centers himself.
He is completely missing the point. You cannot just logic away someone's profound grief by pointing out your own great qualities. It's a massive failure of empathetic listening.
It is, but it's also a profoundly human moment. Henry notes that Elkanah is genuinely grieved by her grief, which, is the mark of a loving husband in that era, but his comfort is just deeply misguided. He is basically asking her to mathematically balance her crosses with her comforts.
Like an accounting ledger.
Exactly. Like you don't have a child, but you have me, so the equation should balance out to happiness. But human psychology just doesn't work like a ledger. Hannah's pain is way too existential for a quick pep talk. So, realizing she cannot get the understanding she needs from her husband or the environment she is in, she takes a fundamentally different route. She rises up, she goes to the temple, and she prays, and in that prayer, she makes a very specific vow.
Okay, I want to push back on the nature of this vow, because I think this is where the modern mind often hits a wall.
Fair enough, yeah.
She vows that if God looks on her affliction and gives her a male child, she will give him back to God as a lifelong servant. Specifically, a Nazirite, meaning no razor will ever touch his head, and he will be entirely set apart for temple service.
Right, it's a huge commitment.
To someone living today, this looks identical to bargaining with the universe. It sounds like, if you give me what I want, I'll pay you back. I'll go to church every Sunday if I just get this promotion. Or, God, if you cure this illness, I'll donate half my salary to charity. Isn't treating spirituality as a transactional marketplace highly problematic?
It is a highly problematic framework if that is actually what is happening. And this is exactly why we need to exercise serious discernment when reading ancient texts. If we look at Albert Barnes's commentary, he clarifies that vows of this exact nature were the dominant cultural language of devotion during the era of the judges.
So it's just how they spoke.
Yeah, you can think of Jephthah's tragic vow or the vow surrounding Samson's birth. It was how people in the ancient Near East conceptualized high-stakes spiritual commitment. But if we dig beneath the cultural syntax into the deeper wisdom, as Matthew Henry does, we see something fundamentally different from a transaction. Hannah is not bribing God. A bribe implies you are giving a deity something it needs in exchange for a favor.
Right, which logically falls apart if the deity is supposed to be self-sufficient and sovereign. You can't bribe the owner of the universe.
Precisely. What Hannah is doing is demonstrating a massive shift in human consciousness. She's showing that the very gift she so desperately desires will ultimately be surrendered back to a higher redemptive purpose.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she isn't asking for a son just to satisfy her own ego. She isn't asking for a son just to finally win the bitter zero-sum rivalry with Peninnah and secure her social status. She's asking for a son in order to dedicate him to the divine service.
That completely flips the motive.
It does. Henry puts it beautifully. He says, all our gifts to him were first his gifts to us. She is recognizing absolute sovereign ownership. The psychological posture here is, if you entrust this immense responsibility to me, I will ensure it serves your grander purposes, not my petty domestic squabbles.
That is a staggering shift in perspective, moving from a mindset of, give me this so my pain goes away and I can be happy, to entrust this to me so it can be utilized for greater good.
Exactly.
But just as she reaches this profound level of internal surrender, the external world intrudes in the worst possible way. Eli, the high priest, is sitting nearby on a seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle. He is watching her. He sees her lips moving, but because she is speaking in her heart, he doesn't hear any sound.
Yeah.
And his diagnostic X-ray machine is completely broken.
It is shattered.
He entirely misreads the situation and accuses her of being drunk.
This specific interaction is one of the most telling moments in the entire book regarding the state of the institutional structures of that day. Matthew Henry points out that Eli's rash censure was a symptom of a deeply degenerate age.
How so?
Well, we have to ask, why would the highest religious official in the land immediately assume that a woman praying silently in the temple was intoxicated? The only logical answer is that apparently drunken women at the tabernacle were common enough for him to assume the worst as his baseline diagnostic filter.
That is horrifying.
It really is. The sanctuary had become that corrupted. His baseline expectation was debauchery, not piety.
It is terrifying that his immediate diagnostic filter for a praying woman is intoxication. That alone tells us everything we need to know about what he was used to seeing. So the environment is so thoroughly toxic that genuine, desperate piety is mistaken for public drunkenness.
And he doesn't just think it, he confronts her.
Right. Eli actually says to her, "How long will you be drunk? Put your wine away from you." Think about being Hannah in that exact second. You are already bullied relentlessly by Peninnah. Your husband just minimized your grief. You finally gather the courage to bring your brokenness to the ultimate place of sanctuary, and the top religious leader in the nation accuses you of being a drunk.
It's the ultimate insult.
If that were me, I would lose my mind. I would storm out. I would be completely justified in telling Eli exactly how incompetent he is.
And that completely natural defensive reaction is why Hannah's response is an absolute masterclass in emotional maturity and self-regulation. How does she respond to this unjust, incredibly painful accusation? She doesn't, as Henry phrases it, return censure for censure.
She restrains herself.
She does. She doesn't deflect by pointing out that Eli's own sons, which, we will get to shortly, are actually the ones corrupting the tabernacle. Instead, she gently, firmly, and respectfully clears her name. She says, "No, my lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord."
Poured out my soul. That phrase is so vivid. It perfectly captures the psychological mechanism of what she is doing. Think about a time when you have felt deeply misunderstood, or when you are carrying unresolved trauma.
Yeah, you just freeze up.
Exactly. The natural physiological human reaction is to clench, to fret, to harden yourself, to build defensive walls, or to lash out aggressively at the Peninnahs and Elis in your life. We bottle up the bitterness, and it literally poisons our own neurochemistry. But the mechanism Hannah uses is the exact opposite. She doesn't bottle it. She pours it out. How does this pouring out actually function as a psychological and spiritual tool?
The mechanism of pouring out is essentially the complete relinquishing of control over the pain. When you keep it bottled up, you are still trying to manage it, hide it, or weaponize it.
You're holding on to it.
Right. Pouring it out means externalizing the internal chaos. You articulate the raw, unfiltered truth of your despair to a source greater than yourself without demanding an immediate fix. And look at the empirical result for Hannah. The text explicitly notes that after this interaction, after Eli realizes his catastrophic mistake and offers a blessing of peace, she goes her way, she eats, and her face is no longer sad.
That detail is the most crucial part of the entire chapter. This total change in her countenance happens before she is pregnant. She does not have the baby yet.
Nothing external has changed.
Not a single thing. She goes back home to the exact same toxic household. Peninnah is still there. Elkanah is still clueless. The external circumstances haven't shifted 1 millimeter, but her internal state has been completely transformed.
Precisely. Henry calls this kind of authentic prayer heart's ease. The mechanism worked. She left her burden at the tabernacle. She surrendered the need to control the outcome. That is the true power of honest, unfiltered pouring out of grief. It detaches your internal peace from your external circumstances.
That's incredibly powerful for anyone listening right now who's dealing with an unchangeable situation. So she goes back to Ramah. The text says the Lord remembered her. She conceives, and she gives birth to a son. She names him Samuel, which translates to heard of God, memorializing the fact that she was heard in her affliction.
And she keeps her promise.
She does. She waits until he is weaned, fulfilling her vow, and brings this young child back to Shiloh to serve in the tabernacle under Eli. And the transition from her personal triumph to what happens next is just a brilliant piece of literary pacing. We move from the micro-level victory of one marginalized woman into a macro-level critique of the entire national power structure. Chapter 2 opens with this incredible prophetic poem known as Hannah's Song.
It is a breathtaking piece of literature. Albert Barnes notes that it is formally a prophetic psalm. In the broader context of biblical literature, it takes its rightful place right alongside the great paradigm-shifting songs of Miriam after crossing the Red Sea, Deborah after her military victory, and most notably, the Virgin Mary's Magnificat in the New Testament.
Wow, so it's in a very specific lineage of songs.
Yeah, in fact, if you look closely at the Greek text of Luke, Mary's song heavily echoes, and in some places directly quotes, the thematic structure of Hannah's song. They're both singing about the exact same divine mechanism.
So let's break down that mechanism, because she starts by talking about her own personal vindication, how her mouth is enlarged over her enemies, which is a clear nod to surviving Peninnah's abuse. But then the song rapidly expands. It becomes this massive, sweeping philosophical statement about how the entire world is governed. What is the core theology she is introducing here?
Well, if we peel back the layers of the commentary here, the song outlines the great vicissitudes, the sudden, complete reversals of human life. It is a profound meditation on the divine reversal of human status and the absolute fragility of human power structures.
She goes right after the powerful.
She does. She sings, "The bows of the mighty are broken, while those who stumbled are suddenly armed with strength. Those who were full and comfortable have to hire themselves out just for a piece of bread, while the hungry cease to hunger. The Lord raises the poor out of the dust and lifts the needy from the literal dunghill to make them sit with princes and inherit a throne of glory."
It is the ultimate underdog anthem. But it's more than just cheering for the little guy. It's making a terrifying claim about the systems of power that we think are permanent. Whether it is military might, like the bows of the mighty, or hoarded economic wealth, like those who were full, or entrenched social status, Hannah is asserting that they are inherently fragile because, as she says, the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. It's an assertion that moral reality will eventually overwrite material reality.
Exactly. And this isn't just a nice poetic thought to celebrate a baby. It deliberately sets the thematic stage for the entire rest of the Book of Samuel, and really the whole history of Israel's impending monarchy.
It's foreshadowing.
100%. It is a stark warning to the powerful and a profound comfort to the marginalized. And the author of Samuel uses this song as a devastating literary transition because Hannah's song celebrates how God reverses corrupt power structures, which is the perfect tragic irony. Because right outside the door where she is singing, the ultimate corrupt power structure is actively preying on the people.
The pivot here gives you whiplash.
Yeah, it's brutal. The text immediately pivots from Hannah's pure devotion to the established religious power of the day.
Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas.
Now, the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord. That is how the text introduces them. Sons of Belial is a phrase that commentaries translate as men of absolute wickedness, worthlessness, or mischief. These men are the ordained priests. They are the gatekeepers to the divine for the entire nation. Yet they are entirely devoid of spiritual reality.
They're just empty suits.
Worse than empty. To make this concrete, reading about their specific actions, it is exactly like watching corrupt corporate executives brazenly embezzling pension funds, while the CEO, who happens to be their aging father, just looks the other way. That is a highly accurate modern translation of the institutional dynamic at play. Let's look closely at the specific mechanics of their crimes, because the details really matter here. The ancient law of Moses had very specific, highly regulated rules about what part of a sacrifice belonged to the officiating priest for his livelihood, and what part was to be burned on the altar for God, particularly the fat, which belonged exclusively to the divine.
So there's a clear system.
Right, a very clear system. But Hophni and Phinehas treated the system with absolute contempt. The text describes how they sent their servants with a three-pronged flesh hook. While the worshippers' meat was boiling, the servant would just blindly step into the pot, and whatever the fork brought up, the priest took for himself.
It's pure extortion. They are bypassing the established system to maximize their own profit. And it gets even more aggressive. The text says they started demanding raw meat before the fat was even offered to God on the altar.
They couldn't even wait for the ritual to happen.
No, the worshippers, the everyday people who traveled miles to be there, are actually the ones trying to follow the rules. The people are pleading with the corrupt priests, saying, please, let them burn the fat first, honor God as the law says, and then take as much as your soul desires. But the priest's servants reply, no, give it to me now, and if not, I will take it by force. They're introducing the threat of physical violence right into the sanctuary.
They are entirely subverting the purpose of the institution to feed their own appetites. And on top of the financial extortion and physical intimidation, the text bluntly states they were sleeping with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting.
It's just horrific.
It is systemic abuse of power, sexual exploitation, and financial extortion, all wrapped up in the untouchable cloak of religious authority.
And we must look at the psychological consequence of this rot on the general public. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 17 says, "Therefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord."
That's the real tragedy.
The people stopped wanting to engage with the divine because the mediators of the divine were such monsters. Matthew Henry points out that nothing brings greater reproach on an institution, whether it is a religious body, a political office, or a corporate entity, than the covetousness and sensual indulgence of its leaders. The institution was rotting from the head down, creating widespread cynicism and spiritual apathy across the entire nation.
And this brings us to the complicity of Eli.
Yeah, the CEO.
Exactly. Eli, the high priest, their father, knows about it. The text says he hears all that his sons are doing to all Israel. But how does he address this systemic cancer? He gives them an incredibly weak, ineffective reprimand. He says, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all the people. No, my sons, for it is not a good report that I hear."
It is not a good report. Are you kidding me? They are extorting and abusing the congregation, and his response is the equivalent of a mild HR memo saying, "Hey guys, optics aren't looking great right now."
It's pathetic.
It is a slap on the wrist for massive systemic crimes. But the text follows Eli's weak reprimand with a theological statement that is really jarring. It says they did not heed the voice of their father because the Lord desired to kill them.
Yes. 1 Samuel 2:25. This is one of the most difficult phrases in the early historical books.
Let's dig into that because modern sensibilities are going to trip right over this. If God actively desired or intended to kill them, did they even have a choice in their behavior? How do we possibly square this statement with the concept of human free will? It feels like the game is entirely rigged against them from the start.
It is a major philosophical and theological obstacle. But Albert Barnes' analysis is incredibly illuminating here. He says we have to navigate this text by holding two deeply complex realities in tension.
Okay, what are they?
We cannot mathematically explain exactly how God's sovereign will and human free will interact, but reason and revelation acknowledge both are active. God has no pleasure in the death of the wicked, and yet the punishment of an unrepentant sinner is an accomplishment of universal justice. So how does Barnes reconcile because the Lord desired to kill them with their own moral agency?
Barnes explains it by focusing on the sequence of events. God's will to destroy them was founded entirely upon his perfect foreknowledge of their absolute hardened impenitence.
So they were already too far gone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To translate that 19th century theological language into modern neuropsychology, Hophni and Phinehas had crossed the psychological point of no return. Through repeated conscious choices to extort, abuse, and ignore conviction, they had completely destroyed their own neuroplasticity for empathy or repentance.
They rewired their own brains.
They had hardwired themselves to be predators. They were past the point of correction. So God's judgment was simply the final structural collapse of a moral building they had already demolished from the inside. That makes profound sense. It challenges our modern, highly therapeutic sensibilities that demand a simple, linear morality where everyone always gets a final second chance regardless of their choices. The text is arguing that sometimes the rot goes so deep and the abusers become so entrenched that the structure itself just has to be brought down to protect the innocent.
Exactly. And the tragedy is that Eli could have mitigated this, but he chose not to. Think about the organizations you belong to today, or the family dynamics you exist within. Are you offering a weak, overly mild rebuke to systemic bad behavior just to keep the peace?
To avoid the discomfort of real confrontation.
Right. Eli was willing to verbally reprimand his sons, but he was utterly unwilling to use his authority to remove them from the priesthood. Why? Because as an unnamed prophet tells him at the end of the chapter, Eli honored his sons above God. He was benefiting from the status quo. He liked the prime cuts of meat they were bringing home.
He was complicit.
Highly complicit. We have to ask ourselves, are we tolerating toxic, destructive behavior in our spheres of influence because actually confronting it and dismantling it would cost us too much personal comfort?
Eli's failure to act decisively seals the fate of his entire lineage. The unnamed man of God arrives and prophesies the absolute end of Eli's dynasty. He tells Eli that his arm will be cut off, a metaphor for his strength and authority, and that as a sign of this impending doom, his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will both die on the exact same day. The old power structure is officially marked for demolition.
Which is a heavy transition into the next part of the story.
It is. It transitions us perfectly into the darkness of chapter 3. We move from the log, corrupt chaos of the courtyard into the quiet, dark interior of the tabernacle. The historical context is set with chilling precision in the very first verse. Now the boy Samuel ministered to the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no widespread revelation.
It sets a very bleak tone.
It does. And it specifically notes that Eli's eyes had begun to grow so dim that he could not see. So we have this layered, literal and metaphorical darkness. The leadership is blind, the institution is running on empty rituals, and God is silent.
It is a profound spiritual drought. The religious machinery is still churning. Sacrifices are being made, feasts are being held, but there is no actual communication with the divine. But inside this dark, quiet space, a young boy is sleeping near where the Ark of God is housed. Samuel.
And in the middle of the night, God calls him Samuel. And Samuel wakes up, assumes it is his blind, aging mentor calling for assistance, and runs to Eli's room. Here I am, for you called me. And Eli says, I did not call, lie down again. And this misidentification happens 3 separate times.
It's almost comical.
It is. It is such a deeply relatable psychological moment. It is like getting a notification sound on your phone in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
You instantly assume it's your boss demanding something or an annoying app alert, but it's actually an invitation to something life-changing. Samuel just keeps misidentifying the source of the prompt.
That analogy of the notification perfectly captures the modern dilemma. In a world that is absolutely saturated with noise, digital notifications, and constant demands from our everyday authorities, we often lack true vision. We are so unacquainted with the still small voice of conscience, or intuition, or divine prompting.
We just assume it's the usual noise.
Yeah, how often do we confuse a deep internal calling with just another task we need to complete for our boss, our family, or our social circle? Samuel is utterly conditioned by his environment to serve Eli, so he interprets the transcendent voice through the only mundane framework he currently knows.
He assumes the voice of God is just his boss asking for a glass of water. So how does he break out of that conditioned framework?
Through the intervention of mentorship. And this is where the nuance of biblical narrative shines. For all of Eli's massive, unforgivable failures as a father and a national leader, in this specific, quiet moment, Eli does something incredibly beautiful.
He finally sees what's happening.
He does. By the third time Samuel runs in, Eli's dim spiritual eyes finally perceive that the Lord is calling the boy. And notice what Eli does not do. He doesn't get jealous. He doesn't grow bitter that the God of Israel is bypassing the high priest to speak to a child servant.
Which a lot of leaders would do.
Oh, insecurity would normally flare up immediately. But instead, he instructs Samuel on the ultimate posture for a learner. He tells him, go, lie down, and it shall be, if he calls you, that you must say, speak, Lord, for your servant hears.
Speak, for your servant hears. That phrase represents a total paradigm shift in how we approach the unknown or the divine. Most of the time, our prayers, or even just our internal monologues when we are stressed, are the exact opposite posture. We say, listen, Lord, for your servant is speaking.
We just talk at the problem.
We come with our lists, our anxieties, our demands for how the universe needs to be fixed today. We want to do all the talking. We want to dictate the terms.
Exactly. The practical application here is to actively adopt Samuel's taught response. Can you intentionally quiet your tumultuous thoughts, your anxieties, and the constant digital and social noise of your life to create a serene internal space to actually listen?
That's incredibly hard to do today.
It is, and not to listen so you can immediately rush off and act or fix something, but to simply receive the truth. Matthew Henry notes beautifully that a sedate and composed spirit is the mind best prepared for divine discoveries.
But the truth that Samuel discovers in that composed silence is absolutely devastating. That is the burden of true listening. His very first task as a prophet is terrifying. God tells him that the impending judgment on Eli's house is about to fall, and that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be purged with sacrifice or offering forever.
That a rot is terminal.
It is terminal. And young Samuel has to wake up the next morning, do his chores, open the doors of the tabernacle, and face his mentor with this apocalyptic news.
Henry points out the incredible humility of Samuel in the morning. He just had a direct auditory vision from the Almighty. He has effectively been appointed the new spiritual center of the nation, yet he gets up and faithfully executes his mundane chores. He opens the doors.
He doesn't let it go to his head.
Right, but he is terrified to tell Eli the vision. And we can completely understand why. It is the incredibly heavy psychological responsibility of speaking truth to power, especially when that power is held by someone you deeply love, respect, and depend on for your livelihood.
But Eli forces the issue. He adjures him, putting him under a sacred oath not to hide a single word. So Samuel tells him everything. He doesn't sugarcoat the impending doom. And Eli's response to hearing that his family line will be destroyed is incredibly stoic, almost hauntingly so. He just says, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him."
It is a moment of profound, tragic submission. Eli knows the deep demerits of his family. He knows his sons are monsters, and he knows he enabled them. He doesn't argue with the prophecy. He doesn't try to bargain, make another vow, or offer a sacrifice to change God's mind. He accepts the righteous judgment of a sovereign God.
It's a sobering acceptance.
It is. And from that day forward, the text tells us that all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord. The transition of authority is complete. But the actual doom hanging over Eli's house and the entire nation is about to fall with terrifying violence.
Which brings us out of the quiet tabernacle and straight into the chaos of the battlefield in chapters 4 through 6. We are moving into what can only be described as the fallacy of the magic mascot.
This is where things escalate quickly.
This is where the narrative accelerates into an action movie, but a really dark, disastrous one. Israel goes to war against the Philistines at a place called Aphek, and they get routed. 4,000 Israelite soldiers die in the field. Now, a rational, self-reflective army might step back, analyze their military tactics, or, given the context of the book of Judges, examine their own profound spiritual and moral failures that led to this loss.
You would hope they'd pause and reflect.
But they don't do any of that. Instead, the elders of Israel come up with a brilliant shortcut. They say, "Let us bring the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord from Shiloh to us, that when it comes among us, it may save us from the hand of our enemies."
They assume its mere physical presence on the battlefield will mathematically guarantee victory. And, well, you can see their twisted logic. In the historical past crossing the Jordan River or at the Battle of Jericho, the Ark of the Covenant was present during great miraculous victories. But they are fatally confusing the physical symbol of God's presence with the sovereign will of God himself.
It is sheer, unadulterated foolishness. They are treating the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred, holy object in their entire religion, the literal footstool of the divine, like a lucky rabbit's foot, or like a break-in case of emergency glass in a hallway. They think they can weaponize it.
It's a manipulative tactic.
It is the exact equivalent of a modern politician waving a sacred symbol around, or quoting a religious text out of context, expecting it to automatically cover up a corrupt, self-serving agenda and guarantee them a win at the polls.
That is a perfect synthesis of the underlying pathology. Carnal people governed entirely by their physical senses and immediate desires, always trust in external privileges and institutional symbols while entirely ignoring the painful necessity of internal moral transformation.
They want the quick fix.
They want the power of the Ark without the holiness the Ark demands. You cannot manipulate, domesticate, or weaponize the divine for your own partisan, nationalistic, or personal agenda. The creator of the universe will not be used as a mascot for your team.
And the catastrophe that immediately follows proves this point in blood. The Ark arrives in the Israelite camp, accompanied by the two corrupt priests, Hophni and Phinehas. The Israelites give this massive, earth-shaking shout of triumph. The Philistines hear it, figure out the Ark has arrived, and are initially terrified. They say, "Woe to us! Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods?"
They think they're doomed.
But then, backed into a corner, they rally. They say, "Be strong and conduct yourselves like men, you Philistines, that you do not become servants to the Hebrews." They fight with the desperation of the doomed. And the result, Israel is absolutely slaughtered. 30,000 foot soldiers die. Hophni and Phinehas are killed in the mud. And the unthinkable happens. The Ark of God is captured by the enemy.
The fallout of this defeat is devastating, and it ripples rapidly back to the source of the rot. A messenger escapes the battle and runs all the way to Shiloh, his clothes torn and dust on his head. Eli is sitting on his seat by the side of the road, watching. He is 98 years old, totally blind, and the text notes his heart was trembling for the Ark of God.
He knew it was a bad idea to send it.
It did. The messenger arrives and delivers the crushing blows in sequence. The army has fled, there has been a great slaughter, your 2 sons are dead, and the Ark of God has been captured.
And it is that final piece of news that kills him. The death of his sons was terrible, but the capture of the Ark is the ultimate psychic shock. When the messenger mentions the ark, Eli falls backward off his seat by the side of the gate, his neck is broken, and he dies. The prophecy from chapter 2 is fulfilled.
And the tragedy cascades even further. His daughter-in-law, Phinehas's wife, is heavily pregnant. When she hears the news that the ark is captured and that her father-in-law and husband are dead, the shock induces premature labor. She gives birth to a son, but as she is dying, she ignores the women trying to comfort her. With her final breath, she names the baby Ichabod, which translates to, "The glory has departed from Israel."
What a heavy name to give a child.
Because the Ark of God, the localized glory of their religion, has been taken. It is an incredibly bleak, dark, hopeless ending to the institutional dynasty. The X-ray shows nothing but shattered bones.
But then the narrative shifts perspective.
Yeah.
And it gets, well, weird, like ancient Near Eastern, bizarrely dark and strange.
It really does. We move into chapter 5, and the focus shifts entirely to the Philistines. They have captured the Ark, and they take it back to Ashdod, one of their major Pentapolis cities. They place it in the temple of their chief deity, Dagon, right beside the statue of Dagon. Now, we have to understand the ancient mindset here. By placing the captured Ark in Dagon's temple, they aren't just storing it, they are making a massive theological statement.
They're claiming superiority.
They are declaring that Dagon has defeated Yahweh. They are enhancing their triumph by forcing the God of Israel to symbolically bow as a vassal to the God of the Philistines.
But the God of Israel does not play the role of a captive vassal very well. The next morning, the priests of Dagon come into the temple, and the statue of Dagon has fallen flat on its face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they probably think, oh, earthquake, bad mortar, and they set him back up in his place.
They try to prop their God back up.
Exactly. But the next morning, they come in early, and Dagon has fallen on his face again before the ark. But this time, the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands are broken off and lying on the threshold. Only the torso is left intact.
And we cannot skim past the cultural significance of this specific mutilation. Albert Barnes clarifies that in ancient Near Eastern warfare, cutting off the head and the hands of a defeated enemy was the ultimate, universally recognized proof of absolute conquest and subjugation.
So it's very deliberate.
Highly deliberate. The head represents the intellect and the authority. The hands represent the power to act and make war. By decapitating and dismembering the idol, the text is showing that the ark doesn't need an Israelite army to defend it. The profound holiness of God actively dismantles the false, idolatrous structures that try to contain or subjugate it.
And it doesn't stop with the statue. The divine defense mechanism turns into full-blown biological warfare against the Philistine population. The text says the hand of the Lord was heavy on the people of Ashdod, and he ravaged them, struck them with tumors, which older translations call emerods, and commentators like Barnes clarify are likely hemorrhoids or some form of severe bubonic plague swelling, and simultaneously a plague of mice ravages their agricultural land.
It's a complete societal breakdown for them.
The Philistines panic. They move the ark from Ashdod to Gath. The plague breaks out in Gath. They try to move it to Ekron. The Ekronites literally cry out, "They have brought the ark of the God of Israel to us to kill us and our people." Everywhere the ark goes, death, disease, and panic follow.
It is a total dismantling of Philistine hubris. The lords of the Philistines finally realize they are holding a radioactive core of divine judgment. They call their priests and diviners and ask how to send it back. The diviners say, "You can't send it back empty. You must return a trespass offering." So they forge 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice, representing their 5 cities.
Which is just such a bizarre offering.
It is, but it fits their superstitious mindset. They build a new cart, hitch it to 2 milk cows who have never been yoked and whose calves are shut up at home, and they say, "If the cows go up the road toward Israel, we know God did this. If they don't, it was just a coincidence." And miraculously, against all maternal and bovine instinct, the cows walk in a straight, unswerving line all the way to the Israelite town of Beth Shemesh.
The Philistines essentially surrender to the reality that they cannot handle this power. But here, as the ark crosses back into Israelite territory at Beth Shemesh, we hit another massive narrative obstacle. The Israelites in Beth Shemesh are harvesting wheat. They look up, see the ark coming on a cart, and they're overjoyed. They sacrifice the cows, chop up the wood of the cart, and offer a burnt offering. It seems like a happy ending.
It really does.
But then their curiosity gets the absolute better of them. Some of the men decide they want to look inside the ark. And because they pry off the lid and look inside, the text says God struck the people and struck down 50,070 men. Okay, we have to stop here. How on earth do we make sense of this? Tumors, decapitated statues, and now a massacre of over 50,000 Israelites just for looking inside a gold box. Modern listeners, understandably, are going to recoil at this terrifying level of divine violence. It sounds like the climax of an Indiana Jones movie where the Nazis' faces melt off. How do we responsibly analyze this?
We have to lean heavily on the theological insights of the commentaries to understand the ancient, utterly uncompromising concept of holiness. Today, we operate with a highly domesticated therapeutic view of spirituality. We want a God who functions as a friendly life coach or an empathetic therapist.
We want him to be safe.
Exactly. But this text is portraying a radically different reality. It is showing that God is not a tame, manageable force. The Philistines had to learn that captured sacredness destroys the captor. But the Beth Shemites, the Israelites themselves, had to learn an even harder lesson. Proximity to the sacred does not give you permission to be presumptuous.
But they were Israelites. They were the chosen people. Shouldn't they have a pass to interact with their own religious artifacts?
Not at the expense of reverence. Matthew Henry points out that they treated the sacred with flippant, casual disrespect. The Ark of the Covenant was designed to be lodged deep within the Holy of Holies, hidden behind a thick veil, unseen even by the regular priests, and only approached by the high priest once a year under very specific conditions.
So they were blatantly breaking the rules.
By deciding to pry off the mercy seat to look inside, the men of Beth Shemesh were boldly intruding into forbidden knowledge merely to gratify a sinful, presumptuous curiosity. The lesson the text is brutally enforcing is that presumptuous familiarity with the holy carries ultimate consequences. It's a terrifying reminder that divine power is infinitely dangerous when approached without absolute reverence and obedience.
It is the exact opposite of the magic mascot fallacy. You cannot control him as a weapon,
Right.
and you cannot be casual with him as a curiosity. The sheer, unapproachable holiness of God demands profound respect, and the surviving Israelites in Beth Shemesh finally realize this. They are terrified. They cry out, "Who is able to stand before this holy Lord God?" So they quickly send messengers to the inhabitants of Kirjath-Jearim, begging them to come down and take the ark away.
And this sets the stage for our final movement, Section 5, the Ebenezer principle, where we see how a nation actually goes about repairing this kind of catastrophic spiritual damage.
Yes. Chapter 7 opens with the men of Kirjath-Jearim taking the ark into the house of Abinadab on a hill, where it sits for 20 long years. It is a period of deep national depression. The text tells us that all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. They deeply missed the presence and favor of God, but they are still living under the oppressive thumb of the Philistines. Lamenting, crying, and feeling miserable has become their baseline state.
And here comes Samuel, who is now a fully grown man and the recognized spiritual leader of the nation. He steps into this 20-year depression and issues a massive challenge. He tells all the house of Israel, "If you return to the Lord with all your hearts, then put away the foreign gods and the Ashtaroth from among you, and prepare your hearts for the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines."
Which is a huge call to action.
It is a crucial, universally applicable insight into human change. True reform, whether personal, institutional, or national, requires much more than just feeling bad about your situation. Lamenting your pain is not the same thing as repenting of your actions.
That is such a fine line, but an important one.
Samuel is telling them that if they want a different outcome, they have to structurally remove the toxic influences from their environment. They cannot just cry to Yahweh while keeping their altars to the fertility goddesses, the Ashtaroth, active on the side as an insurance policy. They had to literally, physically demolish the idols they had been relying on.
It is the fundamental difference between being sorry you got caught in a bad situation and actually changing your behavior to get out of it. So the children of Israel actually do it. They put away the Bazals and the Ashtaroth, and Samuel calls for a massive national gathering at a place called Mizpah. They gather, they fast all day, and they confess, "We have sinned against the Lord." But they also perform this fascinating, deeply symbolic ritual. They draw water and pour it out on the ground before the Lord. How does the physical act of pouring out water function as a mechanism of repentance? What is the psychology behind this?
Matthew Henry's commentary explores this beautiful symbol perfectly, explaining the psychological mechanism it triggers. Pouring out water into the dirt represents acknowledging your own absolute fragility. It forces the human brain to physically manifest a reality it usually tries to deny, which is permanence.
Because once the water hits the dirt, it's gone.
Exactly. Once water is spilled on the ground, it cannot possibly be gathered up again. It is utterly spent. By pouring the water, the Israelites were publicly acting out the pouring out of their own pride, their self-reliance, and their stubbornness. The practice for anyone listening to this today is profoundly simple, but incredibly difficult. When you realize you need a complete fresh start, how can you practice pouring out your pride? You have to find a way to physically, verbally, or structurally empty yourself of your illusion of self-sufficiency.
But of course, the universe doesn't just let you repent in peace. The moment you become vulnerable, the old habits or the old enemies attack. The lords of the Philistines hear that the Israelites have gathered in one place at Mizpah, and they march out to crush them. The Israelites hear the army coming, and they are terrified. They are unarmed, fasting, and gathered for a church service, not a battle. But notice the massive psychological growth here. 20 years ago at the Battle of Aphek, their immediate reflex was to run and grab the Ark of the Covenant to use as a magic weapon.
They don't do that this time.
No. But this time, they don't look for a shortcut. They turn to Samuel and plead, "Do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines."
They have actually learned the excruciating lesson of the past 2 decades. They rely on humble intercession, not a manipulative magic mascot. Samuel responds by taking a suckling lamb, which perfectly represents pure, defenseless reliance on God, and offers it as a whole burnt offering. He cries out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answers. As the Philistines draw near to attack, the text says the Lord thundered with a loud thunder upon the Philistines that day, and so confused them that they were overcome before Israel. The Israelites pursue them and rout them completely.
It is a total miraculous victory achieved not through their own military genius, but through their posture of complete surrender. And after the battle, Samuel does something so important for human psychology. He takes a large stone, sets it up between Mizpah and Shen, and names it Ebenezer, which literally translates to stone of help. And he declares to the people, "Thus far the Lord has helped us."
And that brings us to the Ebenezer principle, the psychology of remembrance.
Explain how that works, because it's brilliant. It's essentially like keeping a very specific journal of your hardest days. When you are going through a brutal crisis, a health scare, a massive financial loss, a toxic relationship, you write down how you survived it. You document the exact moment the relief came. Why? So that when the next crisis hits, and it always will because life is full of Philistines marching over the hill, you don't have to rely on your panicked, faulty memory. You can look back at that journal or that stone and have tangible, physical, historical proof that you have been delivered before. It grounds your present, spiraling anxiety in solid historical reality.
That is exactly the actionable takeaway from Chapter 7. I highly encourage you to build your own Ebenezer. What physical marker, what specific habit, or what documented memory can you establish in your life today to serve as a permanent reminder of past deliverance? We all possess an incredible capacity for spiritual and emotional amnesia the moment a new threat appears. We need that physical stone of help to look back on when the anxieties of our own lives march against us. We need to be able to look at it and say, "Thus far, I have been helped. I will survive this too."
It absolutely changes your entire physiological response to stress when you have that marker to look at. We have covered a staggering amount of ground today. We moved from the intensely personal pain of a toxic household to the systemic rot of corrupt priests, through the devastating fallacy of the magic mascot, all the way to the structural realities of true nation-saving repentance. Before we go, what is the ultimate through line here? What is the final provocative thought we should be walking away with to chew on?
Well, I mean, if we look back across the entire massive arc of these 7 chapters, there is one resounding, unavoidable theme. The external systems, the established institutions, and the religious formulas we so desperately rely on for safety, whether it is Eli's centuries-old priesthood or treating the physical Ark of the Covenant as an invincible weapon in battle, they will all eventually catastrophically fail us if our internal moral posture is corrupt. True security, true power, was never actually found in the entrenched power structures of Shiloh. It was found in the honest, pouring out tears of a marginalized, barren woman. It was found in a young boy willing to sit in the dark and say, "I am listening." So the question you must ask yourself as you navigate your own life is this: what rigid structures, what formulas, or what external mascots are you trusting today that might actually be getting in the way of your true internal transformation?
That brings us right back to our opening thought. We desperately want our lives, our spirituality, our institutions to be like a clean, binary medical x-ray. We want the simple formula: carry the ark, win the battle, make the vow, get the kid. But the diagnostic landscape of the human heart is messy. It is muddy. Institutions rot from the inside out when we tolerate comfortable corruption. And the only cure to that rot isn't a magical quick fix or a new coat of paint. It is stepping into the mud, admitting your own fragility, structurally removing the idols you've grown attached to, and honestly pouring out your soul. That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.